I believe we started out looking at segmented worms, the annelids, right? And then we did the mollusks. We had 2 labs of mollusks, one of diversity and one of dissection, squid and clam. And then we had the arthropods. I think we had 4 labs of the arthropods. We had the trilobites, chelicerates, and myriapods, the millipedes. And then we had the crustaceans. And then we had the insect dissection. And then we had insect diversity, where I had to make a dichotomous key and then a viable insects. We have 4 arthropod labs. So this lab is kind of something different here. It's looking at, we're going to look at animal cells and tissues. This handout is on campus. But there's kind of a lot of information here, but I'll try my best to kind of give you major hints on what I'm going to ask. Right? So just kind of pay attention to those to get basic information. So we're going to look at 4 different kinds of animal tissues: epithelium tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And I'm not going to be able to ask you about all of these tissues, but I do want to give you examples of them all. This is chapter 33. So when we're looking at animal cells and tissue, we're looking at the types of cells that are specialized for the tissue function. Obviously, muscle cells are really a unique type of tissue. So we'll look at the types of muscles that occur. Epithelium is the integument or the body linings, the outer linings and the inner linings of the body. And then connective tissue, as the name implies, kind of holds it all together. So this is just an overview of kind of why we're covering this, because basically animals are all assembled by the same types of cells. Okay, so first off, we're going to look at epithelium. And epithelium, the key thing with epithelium, what epithelium has that no other tissue type has, is a basement membrane. So epithelium is a it's a protective layer. So it's your outer skin, your integument is epithelium. But also the lining of your intestines is epithelium. And the lining of your body cavity, your coelom, is epithelium. And so one key feature is this basement membrane is a membrane that separates your epithelium from other tissue types. So the epithelium is usually is the outer layer, or the inner lining layer, and then the basement membrane separates the epithelium from the connective tissue or muscle tissue or whatever. So we'll give you some examples there. Okay, so there's 2 general types of epithelium. There's simple epithelium. Simple is a single layer epithelium. So simple epithelium means that it's only a single layer of cells. And then it's the shape of the cells that dictates the rest of it. So squamous cells are typically flattened. So simple squamous epithelium is how it's correctly classified. So these cells, if you look at them from a side view, are like pancakes. So here's the cells, they're kind of flattened. Here's the dots in the middle of the nuclei. And so these are kind of flattened cells, single cell layer, and the basement membrane is proximal, meaning it basement. Okay, so when I use this term proximal, what I mean is closer to the middle of the body. Proximal means closer to your inner core or your midline. And And then the opposite of proximal would be distal, would be farther out. So the cells are the outer lining exposed to the air or the inside of your gut tract. The basement membrane is essentially connected to either muscle or connected tissue or what have you. So the example of simple squamous epithelium I have, because this is only a single cellular, I don't have the examples of it from the side view. I only have examples of the top view. And the example I have is frog skin. So frog skin is the slide I'm using. And what you're going to see basically is what looks like a bunch of fried eggs or pancakes. I say fried eggs because it has a nucleus in the middle, like this. So these are basically a single layer of cells, and you're not going to see the basement membrane. The basement membrane is so thin and transparent that you don't see it, especially from the top view. On other tissue types, you'll see where the basement membrane is, but it's basically the border between the epithelium and other tissue types. So I'm kind of identifying basement membrane, but you won't actually see the basement membrane. You'll just see where it is represented or where it's supposed to be. If that makes sense. Okay, so that's simple squamous epithelium is the frog skin. It's over here on the far side, labeled as frog skin. And you're really just kind of seeing tissue like that. Okay, and then the next level of complexity or whatever would be cuboidal. So it's simple cuboidal epithelium is what is properly labeled. And as the name implies, these cells are kind of like cubes. They're sort of brick-like, block-like. Okay, and then I'm representing the nucleus with a dot there. And again, we have a basement membrane that is proximal. Right? Okay, the example of this would be the lining of your kidney tubules. So I have some kidney tissue on a slide here. Kidney tubules. Cuboidal epithelium is more for secretion. Secretion or excretion would be an example of where cuboidal epithelium applies. So you find it in glandular tissue ducts, like the ducts of your salivary glands would have cuboidal epithelium. But the example I'm giving you is the kidney tubules. And what you're going to see is the cuboidal cells kind of line or wrap around a tube or a cavity. So it looks something like this. And what you're going to see basically is like several of these kind of twined together. So it's not like a flat layer, like I showed here. It's basically like cuboidal cells that are surrounding a tubule. So here is that. The basement membrane, you won't see the actual membrane, but you'll kind of see where it is because it's separating the cells from other cell types. The basement membrane. And then what you're typically going to see is like other connective tissue around, like this. So a lot of these slides have more than one tissue type, but I want you to kind of identify the specific type. So here's the kidney tubule. That's the inside of the, what's called the lumen of the kidney tubule. But the tissue we're looking at is this is cuboidal epithelium because the kidney tubule is basically excreting urea. It's for transferring urea into your bladder. All right? There's a slide that says kidney, but that's cuboidal epithelium. All right, and the third type of cell is called columnar. simple columnar epithelium, this is a kind of a column-like cell, and so it's usually taller than it is wide. So the columnar cells can have other features. I'm not going to ask you about these features, but sometimes you hear about ciliated columnar or microvilli columnar or pseudostratified columnar. They're all kind of variations of the same thing. I'm just going to ask you about columnar in general. I'm not going to get super specific like you would in an anatomy class. But let's just finish these out here. Okay, so there those are column-like cells. Here's our basement membrane, like this. Basement membrane. Anyway, where you find columnar epithelium is usually where you have like absorption happening. You find columnar epithelium like in the lining of your lungs, where your lungs are absorbing oxygen and exchanging CO2. Or the lining of your small intestines where you're absorbing nutrients from your food. So that's typically where you find columnar. So there is a slide that I really like to put on the test here that has several tissue types. But what we'll look at here is the gut endothelium. What that means is the inner lining. So it's epithelium, but it's on the inside, so it's called endothelium. So your gut endothelium, the lining of your small intestines. And what that looks like is something like this. It'll be columnar cells that kind of go around a gut tube. It looks a little different on the slide, but this is kind of the general idea. Is they're elongate cells rather than cube-like cells, kind of the main thing. So here is the gut endothelium, like that. Again, you won't see the basement membrane, but you'll see where it is represented like this. Here. And then on this small intestine slide, that's kind of what the slide is. This is a frog small intestine. The frog small intestine. There are several other tissue types. I'm just going to go ahead and draw them right now, but I'll refer to them in a moment. There will be a smooth muscle surrounding this gut tube. I'll label them. And then on the very outside, there will be stratified epithelium. That's our next issue. Well, it looks something like the overall appearance of it is something like this. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at, but the columnar epithelium specifically is this tissue here, in that lining that gut tube. Okay. So the frog small intestine will certainly be a slide that I have on the test, because I can ask about this simple columnar epithelium, and I can also ask about stratified epithelium. So stratified epithelium what this is basically is it's more than one cell layer. It's like multiple layers of cells of epithelium. Oftentimes, stratified epithelium is called stratified squamous or stratified columnar. There's oftentimes multiple names given to it. I think for our purposes, it's okay if you just recognize it as stratified. And I'll show you why. Because usually what happens with stratified epithelium is the more proximal layers, the layers that are closer to the basement membrane, are usually like cuboidal. And then as you go more distal, they become flatter and flatter. So it's kind of like a hybrid type of tissue. So in stratified epithelium, we have kind of boxy cuboidal cells near the basement membrane. And then as you go out, the cells kind of become more and more flat. So you get so the example of this would be like your skin is a stratified epithelium. Typically, anatomy books will call it stratified squamous epithelium because as you go more distal, the cells go from cuboidal to flat, right? So, but I think for our purposes, I'm going to be okay with you just saying stratified epithelium is epithelium that's basically in multiple layers. Usually, it starts out cuboidal at the base, and then they get flatter as they go. And in fact, like in the skin, the farthest out layer are dead keratinized cells. These are cells that have become, they're no longer living cells, they're no longer functioning, but they're kind of a protective layer that sloughs off. So you can think of like what dandruff is. Dandruff is your dry scalp skin that is kind of sloughing off. But your whole body does that. You have to have a protective layer if you get an abrasion. Something rubbed up against you rough. You have dead skin cells on the surface that protect your cells. And the basement membrane is proximal here. Okay. The cool thing is the stratified epithelium. Usually this is an example of this would be like skin or linings of things. Skin is a good example, or human skin. But there is an example of stratified epithelium, the outer lining of your small intestine. So that's why this frog small intestine is useful on the exams. I've been asked about 2 or 3 different tissue types for one spot. So plan on seeing a frog small intestine. We'll get to the muscle and connective tissue here in a second. We good? Yeah, thanks.
Are the cuboidal and columnar, are those also proximal and distal?
I think that yeah, it's kind of hard to explain it that way, but I would say that the center of mass here is where the muscle is. So distal is that way, but also that way, so it doesn't apply. Okay. So it's kind of hard. I guess maybe if we didn't look at this as a circle, we just look at a section. So proximal would be closer to the core, which is the middle of the muscle, and distal would be like either in the limb or on the outside. So yes, that doesn't totally apply.
Okay.
I only mention that proximal versus distal because I might use that term on the exam to ask you about what the is.
Okay.
So, but I won't ask you to say which way is proximal or distal intestine. So I might say something like the layer that's proximal separating this tissue from deeper layers is called a basement membrane. So the answer would be, right? So I'm just throwing the term out there so you know what proximal means. So people don't raise their hand and go, what's proximal? Okay. Got it? So this is basically the epithelium types. There's 2 main types, simple and stratified. And then among the simple, we're also separating them into flattened squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Okay. So probably not going to have that one on the test because I can only ask one thing about frog skin. That's what it is, right? I like to have it that way. That's like the only thing. I may ask the cuboidal epithelium because I can ask you what the function of the tissue is, and I can ask you about the basic membrane. But certainly I will have a frog small intestine and probably ask you about 3 different tissue types on this. I'm just listing 2. The simple columnar and the stratified campsite, right? Okay. All right. And this, this is a, this is like a crash course in tissues. Typically in anatomy, you spend a whole lab on epithelium, and then a whole lab on connective tissue, and a whole lab on muscle tissue. So this is definitely kind of a fast-paced deal. All right, here's an example of these tissue types. Here is frog skin, squamous epithelium. You can see they're kind of flattened cells. Yeah.
Did we need to know about the pseudo-stratified or?
No. Yeah, that's what I was saying was that that the pseudostratified basically is just a columnar tissue.
Okay.
It just looks like stratified. It's not. So in my opinion, pseudostratified is just explaining a variation.
Got it.
So I won't ask that. Also, I won't ask you about villi, which are the little finger extensions of these, or ciliated. So if you look at the textbook, it'll explain like your lungs have ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. To me, it's just columnar, right? The other added stuff is interesting, but it's probably a little bit too much detail for me. Good question. So just know it as columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified, all that means basically is it's overlapping cells that pseudostratified. Okay, so here we have squamous epithelium. Here we have cuboidal epithelium, right? Lining this tube. Here we have simple columnar epithelium. This is also columnar epithelium, but this would be the example of what pseudostratified is. They're columnar cells, but they're kind of weaving in and out back and forth. And this also has cilia. This is like a lung lining here. But if I was to have that on a test, you basically would say, oh, that's columnar epithelium, simple columnar epithelium. And then this is stratified epithelium. You can see that approximately here. You can see where the basement membrane is because there's kind of a sharp line between this tissue, connective tissue, and the epithelium. And you can see there's multiple layers of cells here. So this is stratified epithelium. Just kind of showing you different examples. Okay. Again, you can't really see the basement membrane, but you can see where it is because there's a sharp demarcation between the epithelium layer and the connective tissue below. Okay. Speaking of connective tissue, this is probably the most varied type of tissue. Connective tissue is what holds all your tissues together. And I'm super simplifying this as well. Connective tissue. So connective tissue kind of has a theme. It's based on a fibers and matrix. So if you think about connective tissue in terms of it's composed of a fibrous component and a matrix component, it kind of helps you understand the difference between different connective tissue types. So what fibers are protein fibers that kind of operate like strings or like rubber bands or like filaments. Think of like spaghetti as the fibers. Matrix is kind of like the cellular gelatin. So think of like Jell-O as the matrix. So if you were to make a Jell-O that had spaghetti in it, that'd be a perfect example of what connective tissue kind of is. And if you have more spaghetti than Jell-O, it's like areolar or dense fibrous or like cartilage. And And if you have more jello than spaghetti, it's like what we're going to find with blood. So that's kind of how connective tissue is classified, is based on the relative abundance and shape of the fibers versus the matrix. Okay. So starting off here, we're going to look at I'm going to generally classify these, but loose connective tissue is kind of a class that I think is appropriate, but oftentimes it's called areolar. Or areolar is a type of loose connective tissue. So the loose connective tissue is a more general term. Areolar is a specific type. So let me do something here. I'm gonna fix my. I see where I should have actually done this. I should have gone fibers and matrix, because I think it might be useful to show kind of the difference here. So in loose connective tissue, we have loose connective tissue, which is often called areolar. What you have is fibers that are kind of
We need to buy more markers.
Irregular. They're not organized. So this is, I think, loose connective tissue is kind of like the example I gave of if you made a jello that was kind of half jello and half spaghetti. That basically you have the fibers, but you also have the matrix kind of interspersed in. And matrix meaning like jello, I can't really draw jello, but I can kind of imply that we have kind of like this some fibers that are kind of disorganized and space between them that's filled with jello. So where you see this areolar tissue is like, a good example is like if you've ever cooked chicken breasts or chicken, and when you peel the skin off the chicken, you can see it like that spider webby material that's kind of holding the chicken skin onto the muscle. That's an example of areolar or loose connective tissue. So it's kind of like the connective tissue that's holding your skin onto your muscle. Is a great example of.
He's not writing it down.
Related to connective tissue or areolar tissue is adipose tissue. Adipose is fat storage or fat cells. It kind of looks like areolar tissue because it has like fibers associated with it. But in adipose tissue, there are fat globules. You see, like adipose cell. So oftentimes, like for example, under your what's called your belly fat, under your skin on your abdomen, there is kind of a fatty apron there, or like kind of a fat storage area there. Unfortunately, right? So what that is areolar tissue that has fat cells embedded in it, and when the fat cells are embedded in it, it's called adipose tissue. So it's related though to areolar. Okay, so that is as opposed to what's called dense or fibrous. Dense or fibrous connective tissue would be things like tendons. The tissue that connects your muscle to your bone is kind of like a really rigid fibrous tissue. And this would be like mostly fiber and very little matrix. So there's various kinds of this. There's reticular, some that are kind of like elastic. And you can have a essentially fibrous. We're just going to go ahead and call it all fibrous. But the examples of this would be ligaments and tendons. And it's basically more fiber than matrix. So if you think about like when you eat a drumstick, there is a kind of a fibrous white hard structure that kind of attaches the muscle to the bone. And that is tendon basically, and it's dense fibrous connective tissue. So going around the horn here, this is areolar connective tissue. Here you can see a lot of space. It looks like spaghetti and jello. Here is adipose, and these adipocytes basically are kind of fat cells that are collected in there. Those two are kind of related. Here are two examples of fibrous or dense connective tissue. There's some that's called reticular, which is like kind of a wavy. It's for elasticity, so it can stretch. Some ligaments are stretchy. Or you can have more dense. It looks like it almost looks like muscle because it has such a great fiber. Okay. So we have these here. We have areolar. We have adipose. We have fibrous. Let me change these around, put them in order. Areolar, adipose, fibrous, and elastic. Those are both examples of fibrous. And then there is cartilage. Cartilage is a more of a stiff kind of a skeletal type connective tissue. Cartilage is trying to think here. It's mostly fiber, but the fiber is it's kind of like a plastic. Think of like if your jello was really thick, or if you had a lot of spaghetti in your jello, mostly spaghetti, very little jello. If you like this fibrous dense connective tissue, but if you maybe think of like cartilage as like baking a cake or something. Once that jello turns kind of firm and dries out, that's kind of what cartilage is. I'm trying to clear here. But what cartilage basically is we have kind of, you know what cartilage looks like to me? Is it looks like, in the microscope, it looks like marshmallows. Like marshmallows. But the cartilage cells are kind of, I don't like them, but I like cartilage. So where we have cartilage is skeletal type of tissue. And the example that I have here for cartilage is actually a section of I think it's a monkey ear, but like in your ear, you have elastic cartilage that allows your ear to be pliable, but your ear basically has kind of like this mold, so I think of it like plastic. So here's the cartilage cells here. And the cartilage cells are basically intermixed with connective tissue on the outside. And actually, on those monkey ear slides, there is epithelium, stratified epithelium on the far outside. So the layer that is interesting is the cartilage layer. But you can also see stratified epithelium on the same slide. This slide would be the monkey ear, which is supposed to emphasize elastic cartilage, but it also has other tissue types, including areolar tissue as well. So you have cartilage cells, you have areolar tissue connected to cartilage and the epithelium, stratified epithelium outside. So here's an example of cartilage here. And it looks like tree rings, tree growth rings. What I'm drawing here are these rings of how the And they're all originating from the osteocyte or the bone cell in the middle, which that bone cell actually starts out like a cartilage cell, the chondrocyte. But no need to worry about that. When you see bone, what you're seeing basically is this is bone. And bone is what's called ossified. And what ossified means is stone-like. So ossified means like hardened like stone. So think of like if I took my plastic and I poured cement, liquid cement into it, the cement would then cure into this, calcified or calcium-rich hard material. And that's what the bone is. It's ossified with calcium. So I do have some bone here, and the bone looks something like this. Here is the osteocyte, the cell in the middle that starts out like a cartilage cell. And then here are all these layers of rings of calcium that have what are called ossified or hardened cell. So cartilage and bone are related. They're kind of a related tissue. And we're going to see later that in vertebrates, which is where bone appears, that not all vertebrates have bone. Like the sharks, for example, only have cartilage, whereas the bony fishes are where we see bone arise. Okay? So here's kind of like, for example, the connective tissue. We have areolar, fibrous, right? Adipose. It's kind of like three flavors of our kind of general connective tissue. Got it? And this PowerPoint is available on campus for you. And then we have cartilage. There are various kinds of cartilage. There's hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. I'm not going to ask you to differentiate them. Elastic cartilage is like in your ear. Hyaline cartilage is like cartilage that's in your nose, that kind of keeps your nose firm, like stuck out. And then fibrocartilage is like cartilage that's in between your vertebrae. It's used for your like spinal cushions for your discs that separate your vertebrae. And they look different, but generally speaking, they all have a lot of similarities. So I'm just going to ask you for cartilage in general. I won't ask you to differentiate hyaline versus fibro versus elastic. Okay. But certainly bone is kind of a unique cell type to animals. And so cartilage versus bone is important. I won't ask you any of the anatomical parts of bones. Don't worry about the canaliculi or the lacunae. Those are just basically what anatomical features the bone counts for. There's no bone that is hardened or ossified with calcium. It's kind of a big difference. Got it? Okay, blood. So here's cartilage. Here's bone. I'm going to have both of them over here. Okay, interestingly, blood is also classified as a connective tissue. And the main reason blood is classified as connective tissue is because it's made by connective tissue. For you, your blood is made by your red bone marrow and by your spleen. But so blood is classified as connective tissue, but you can think of blood as almost entirely matrix and very, very little fiber. The only part of your blood that's classified as fiber is the platelets that are used to clot your blood. The little protein platelets. Everything else is considered to be matrix. So in blood, we have, we've seen blood examples already. So I didn't put out a mammal blood slide. We've already seen blood with regards malaria and with regards trypanosoma, the parasites. So I think you already have slides of those. But in mammal blood or human blood, the erythrocytes or the red blood cells are anucleated. So these what are called red blood cells, the RBCs, RBCs, red blood cells, these are technically called erythrocytes. So these are the red blood cells that have the hemoglobin that carry the oxygen in mammals, for example. And then there are what are called white blood cells, or leukocytes. These are usually involved in immunity. And so there's monocytes that have a single large nucleus. There are eosinophils. There's a wide variety of them, about a half dozen different types of white blood cells. You can just know these as white blood cells are leukocytes. So essentially what I'm saying is there's two major types of blood cell elements. Red blood cells that carry the oxygen, erythrocytes. White blood cells that are used for immunity and preventing you from getting infections, which are leukocytes. And then the only component that is the matrix, that is the fiber component, would be the platelets. And you can't really see these in the slides that we have, but just note that the platelets are for clotting, the clot factors, and that is the only fibrous component of blood. So, check this out. This is kind of interesting. So I mentioned that red blood cells in humans and mammals in general are anucleated. Check out this blood. And WTF stands for what the frog. The frog blood and fish blood, the erythrocytes are actually nucleated. And that's kind of an interesting pattern, is that not all animals, not all vertebrates, blood is the same. Fish blood, frog blood, and bird blood, reptile blood, looks like this. And the erythrocytes are actually as big as the leukocytes because they're nucleated. And what we'll learn for lab exam 3 is these animals manufacture their blood in their spleen. So their blood is spleen generated. Whereas in mammals, humans, your red blood cells are manufactured in red blood marrow. So it's kind of an interesting pattern. But what I want to point out, like in anatomy, they would never show this because anatomy is kind of so human-based. But actually, most animals don't have blood like what humans do. So it's kind of interesting. So frog blood, I have an example of frog blood over here. You can take a look at, and the frog blood is nucleated. And that's what fish blood, reptile blood, amphibian blood, bird blood is all like. Even the spiny echidna, the egg-laying mammals, have blood like this. So it's kind of interesting pattern. Okay, muscle tissue. Muscle is for movement. Muscle is a unique tissue type. It's kind of like a connective tissue, but it's classified by itself. So muscle has, I'm going to say muscle is its own tissue type. So I don't want to imply that it's not. Here, let me put it over here because this makes it look like I'm classifying muscle as connective tissue. Muscle is its own thing, but we can say it's related to connective tissue in a lot of ways. Okay, there's 3 basic muscle types. Skeletal or striated muscle, and smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Now, most animals have striated or skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is probably, the striated muscle is probably the most primitive or the origin muscle. Not all animals have smooth muscle. For example, arthropods and nematodes don't have smooth muscle. They don't have smooth muscle. And the only animals that have cardiac muscle are vertebrates. So fishes and amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds have cardiac muscle. So it's unique just to a certain small group of animals. That being said, I think I'm going to emphasize striated or skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. I'm not going to have cardiac muscle on the test. because it's so unique to vertebrates that most animals don't have it. So let's go ahead and classify the three types. Skeletal muscle, or what I prefer to call striated. So most textbooks call it skeletal muscle because it is found, basically on skeletal bones, etc. But I'm going to go ahead and call it striated. I think that's more accurate because, for example, jellyfish have striated muscle, but they don't have a skeleton, right? So why would you call it skeleton? So striated muscle is a more accurate term. So striated muscle, you can see has very, very distinct organized fibers. Like this. So parallel fibers like this. Striated muscle also tends to have quite a few nuclei in it. So you can see it's pretty loaded with nuclei. It's really hard to see the individual cells in muscle because the cells kind of run together, so you don't really see distinct cell membranes, but the nuclei kind of imply there's probably a cell here, and a cell here, and a cell here you can see. So it's very, very dense cell material. There's a lot of nuclei in striated muscle. But the main thing you're seeing in striated muscle is what's called the stria, or the striae, the streaks, where the name comes from. So the stria are basically these kind of, it's an artifact of how the muscle is organized, going across the muscle. And how you see this is when you focus on striated muscle, usually at 100x or 450x, you rock the fine focus back and forth, and you can see these streaks kind of appearing and disappearing in muscle. These are the stria. They kind of are perpendicular to the fibers of the muscle. So here is a close-up of striated muscle, and you can see here's a muscle fiber, here's a muscle fiber, and these kind of look like almost like the file or some sort of a perpendicular streak pattern. These are the stria that make the organization of striated muscle. For lecture exam 3 probably, we'll talk about muscle organization and structure and how it functions, physiology of muscle, and you'll see where those stria come from, end caps of the muscle cells, or the muscle protein. Okay, so striated muscle probably will have that on the test because we've already seen that. We saw it with the trichinosis nematodes that were embedded in the bare meat. Smooth muscle is usually visceral muscle or organ muscle. So smooth muscle is often associated with alignment of your intestines. So smooth muscle looks more like this. It's kind of like parallel fibers. There's fewer nuclei in smooth muscle. So usually the nuclei are kind of like few and far between, like that, compared to the striated muscle. And the smooth muscle, the cells aren't as organized, so you don't have any of these kind of cross hatching there. And the best example I have of smooth muscle would be like the frog's small intestine. We would have smooth muscle. So if I ask you about smooth muscle, it will probably be on that frog's small intestine, okay? And so you can see it there. I do have some slides here that say muscle types, and there's striated, smooth, and cardiac on there. The smooth muscle on there is not super easy to tell from striated. So just be sure you see the striated on that slide, muscle type slide. For smooth muscle, take a look at that frog's small intestinality, what you're asking on that. Okay. So smooth muscle. And most animals don't have smooth muscle. The first organism they saw that had muscle would be like a jellyfish, the Nigeria. They have striated muscle. The flatworms have striated muscle. The annelids have striated muscle. I think the smooth muscle is pretty much vertebrates and chordates. So smooth muscle is kind of a small group of organisms that have smooth muscle. Most animals have striated, so that's kind of the most primitive life. Okay, cardiac muscle, even though I'm not going to ask it, let me just show you what it is. Cardiac muscle is kind of like a hybrid between the two. You can kind of think about this, that I mentioned that striated muscle is kind of like your skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is more of your organ muscle, like muscle around your stomach and around your intestines and your capillaries and blood vessels. Cardiac muscle, I believe, or my interpretation is cardiac muscle is a modified smooth muscle. It's a smooth muscle that resembles striated muscle. So what cardiac muscle looks like, and again, I'm not going to ask you cardiac on test, but let me show you what it looks like, is the fibers are kind of interwoven. You have the fibers kind of are like a basket weave. And what's going on with cardiac muscle is your heart is kind of like a ball. You know, it's like a ball. And think of like a woven ball. And when the muscle contracts, muscle usually shortens. But what happens with your heart when your muscle contracts is the ball gets smaller. And so what's happening is you have this interwoven muscle fibers. So they're not parallel like striated or smooth. They're nucleated. They're pretty well nucleated like striated. And cardiac muscle has striations or stria, but they're isolated to the individual fibers. So the stria here are not connected or parallel to the stria here. So it's kind of like each fiber has its own set. So the image here is really hard to see this, but what the main emphasis here is this is kind of like a woven or a braided muscle type. And there is stria on there, but it's kind of hard to see there. So I'm not going to have cardiac test. So on the lab exam, cardiac muscle is never a correct answer, got it? But I'm going to tell you what it is anyway, because it's an important muscle type found in vertebrates. All right? Sound good? Okay, so the last tissue type, so we're now at the end. Can you believe it? So here's the three-level types. Striated, you see the striated, you see the lots of nuclei. This one also has lots of nuclei. You see this, I think it's close to zoom. This is smooth muscle, and this is cardiac, but kind of like interwoven. This one won't be intestinal. It'll be smooth muscle on the frog small intestines, and probably if I do striated muscle, it'll be bilateral. Okay? All right, then we have neuron tissue or neurological tissue, nervous tissue. Neural tissue or neuron tissue, there's basically two cell types. We have neurons plus we have neuroglia. That green is too close to the teal colors. So go ahead and do neurons plus neuroglia. Okay, so we're going to focus in on the neurons. The neurons are basically the nerve cell that sends the message very quickly from one end to the other. There's many kinds of neurons, but a typical bipolar neuron would be like this. Something like this. And you're not going to see all these features, but I want to label some parts and explain why they're called this. Okay? So here's a typical neuron. And the parts would be, we have the cell body is where the nucleus is. The cell body is where the nucleus is housed, and it can be in the middle or on the end, like this one. But here's the important part. These are called dendrites. And what dendrites means in Latin is tiny trees. So these little branching structures near the cell body are usually where the message is received in the neuron. Like it receives a stimulus from either a sensory cell or another nerve cell. And then the message is sent down what's called the axon. The axon is kind of like the elongate message sending broadcasting wire of the nerve cell. And then the message is usually sent out what's called the synapse. The synapse is how the message is sent to the next cell, whether it's a muscle or another nerve cell or a gland or whatever. So that's kind of the major parts of a neuron. So I would like you to kind of generally know how a neuron sort of functions now. The message is received to dendrite. The message is sent down the axon, and the nerve cell communicates to the next cell by the synapse. Now, on these nerve cells, you really can't tell what a dendrite versus an axon is, so I won't say, the pointer is pointing to a blank. But on the test, I could say, on these nerve cells, the message is received at, you should know dendrites, and the message is sent down the axon, and the terminal, the message basically leaves the neuron by the synapse in general terms. So on lecture exam 3, we're going to see how neurons function, and we'll look at neuron physiology there. The neuroglia are all the supporting tissues of a neuron. So there's aster cells, and there are kind of support cells. The neuroglia are all over. One key neuroglia is called a myelin sheath. So myelin is an example of neuroglia, but there's also these kind of what are called they're called like aster cells, which mean like little stars. But I'm not going to ask you to identify those because we don't really have any good examples of them. But I'm mentioning right now that when we talk about neuron physiology, we'll describe unmyelinated neurons versus myelinated neurons. Just realize that neuroglia basically are all the cells that help feed and care for nerve cells, because nerve cells can't care for themselves. You've probably heard that if you get nerve damage, it won't heal itself, because neurons basically, once they're damaged, are kind of permanently messed up. So it's the neuroglia that help support nerve tissue. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff to look at. Just to give you a hint here, probably, or for sure, it's going to be a frog small intestine, asking you about simple columnar epithelium, squamous epithelium, and smooth muscle. Okay. I mean, I could also ask about the connective tissue. I could, or another really good one to ask would be cartilage, because the monkey ear has cartilage in the middle, it has loose connective tissue here, and it also has stratified epithelium on the outside. I've sometimes put bone on the test, and I've asked about bone, and what makes it unique is that it has calcified or calcium hardened cells, basically. So the bone is ossified or hardened with calcium. Probably not going to have dense fibrous connective tissue on the test, because it's hard to tell this from muscle. If I were just to put it on a test and say, what is this? You probably would just easily think it's muscle versus fibrous connective tissue. So I'm going to go ahead and not put any ligaments or tendons on the test. But I will certainly put striatic muscle on there. And if I do ask smooth muscle, it will be on this broad small intestine. Okay. For the neuron, we have a kind of a spinal column smear from a rat here, but definitely see if you can see those neuron tissues. They kind of look like twisted ghosts. I guess you could confuse the neuron tissue with areolar tissue. And that's happened in the past. The students look at the neuron, the neural tissue, and they think it's areolar. And you'll distinctly see these ghost-like neurons. Let me show you here. It looks like this. So that looks kind of like areolar connective tissue, but areolar doesn't have these big ghost-like cell lines. So Some years I've had that, some years I haven't. Kind of hitting this, so I'm kind of like looking to see if I have enough questions. So any questions there? So plan on like 3 or 4 stations that have tissue types. Broad small intestine, monkey ear, striated muscle, those are 3, probably for sures. And then maybe a wild card 4th. It could be kidney tubules or it could be neural tissue, right? Sound good? I haven't decided yet. That's what I'm feeling like. Okay, so that's it for tissue types. I think this is a pretty good representation of what we're looking at. Again, if you take anatomy, you spend like, you know, a couple weeks on this. But we're just cramming it in one lab so we can have cover it. Good. This is going to be microscopes from the compound scopes. I'm leaving them the insect boxes out. I know they're kind of in your way, but you might also want to just start thinking about your insect key you're making. Remember that insect key is going to be worth 6 points, right? The key itself. You're going to turn it in on next Thursday with the lab exam. But up here in the front, I'll have 4 stations with an insect pinned at a microscope. And you can use your key to identify what order that insect is in. And so if you prepare that key is worth 6 points. If you get the insect right,
I'm gonna read my key and
that's like 10% of your test.
look at the bug and look at the
10% out of
spelling of the order. Like I have this, because I need a key.
This box is out, so you can have-
Info, because all
working on
keys
that.
have additional
I have my
info in the back.
insect keys here.
And this is probably what I'm actually
Keys are
gonna
marked with a Post-it note. So I'll open it up to those so you can kind of get some ideas of how many insect keys are functioning. You'll have time on Tuesday also to do this because we'll have Tuesday as a lab review day. So you'll have time Tuesday to also pay attention to creating your insect key. All right? So go ahead and the rest of the lab period is yours, and I'll come around and help you identify these tissue types.